Hello. Yeah. So good morning, everyone. So welcome to day 3 of this year's AGILE Conference, and welcome again to the sunny Glasgow. Yes, it is sunny right now. And so I hope you had enjoyed your yesterday's tour, no matter the city tour, campus tour, or whiskey tour. And today we have our keynote speaker, the second keynote speaker, Dr. Rafael Pereira. And he is a senior researcher in the field of urban analytics, spatial data science, and transport study at the Institute of Applied Economic Research, i.e. Ipea in Brazil. He's the head of the data science team. His research broadly investigates how urban policies and technologies shape the spatial organization of cities, human mobility, as well as their impact on social and health inequalities. Some of his key contributions to the field of urban analytics and planning involves with developing the new methods and open source computational tools to study urban system and transport network. We just communicated that about 10 years ago, when I was in my first year of the PhD study, I saw his brilliant paper about the tool, and I wrote him the email. He sent me the tool, and he walked me through the line by line for the R codes. And at that time, we don't have ChatGPT as well. So he was so nice to illustrate that, and he just told me that he has already packaged it up. It's an R library already. So that is one of his kind of along his numerous tools that he contributes to the academic society. So the reason for his so many contributions has been emerged from his substantive interests around social justice and sustainability issues in urban development, in particular the transport equity and inequalities in access to human opportunities and the environmental impacts of built environments and mobility patterns. He has a background in sociology and demography, and he obtained his PhD in geography from the Transport Studies unit at the University of Oxford. Today, his keynote topic is spatial data science for sustainable and inclusive cities. So welcome again. Let's clap.
Just testing, can you guys hear me well? Okay, very good. So thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Not much of a church person, so I never expected that I would be delivering a keynote speech in a church or what would used to be a church. So it sounds quite special and a bit daunting, to be honest. So as Ming-Chu said, I'm Rafael Pereira, and I work as a senior researcher and head of data science at the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil. For those who don't know, which is, I guess, like all of you, the Institute for Applied Economic Research is a research institution linked to the Brazilian federal government. So we are in this gray zone between academic research and policy decision-making. So we have lots of freedom to set up our own academic research agenda and pursue academic publishing papers and, international collaborations. But sometimes we are called by the government to help on advising policy decision-making, which happens every now and then. So I kind of have two hats. One of them is Rafael, the head of data science, working with, advising decision-making and building a data engineering kind of infrastructure for policy analysis and policy evaluation in Brazil. But I also have my own hat as a researcher pursuing my own research agenda, which I have been for a few years now working on transportation justice, social inequalities, and access to opportunities. So today I'll be talking mostly about this second part. And I'll be giving an overview about some of the advances that we have seen in the past, or the recent past, on urban accessibility and sustainability regarding to human mobility patterns as well. So a lot of us talk about this recent revolution in mobility data. Over the past 10, 15 years, we have seen a plethora of new data sets coming up to the public, or maybe data sets that already existed, but now they're just more easily available. So we have GPS data, mobile phones, smart cards. We saw Samaya and many other colleagues talking about GPS data for mobile phones and Bluetooth sometimes. Traffic cameras, PEMs are portable emission monitoring systems and devices. But I think we don't really talk as much about a different type of data set, which is quite recent, which is GTFS. So GTFS stands for General Transit Feed Specification. So this was a standard data format for public transportation data that was created by Google and the Portland Transport Authority in the mid-2000s. Basically, Google wants to have every public transport system on Google Maps. So you can go and click and plan your trips. To do this, it needed a very simple standard that every city in the world would use to ingest public transport data into Google Maps. Otherwise, every city would be organizing their data in different formats. And GTFS is a very basic kind of relational table with several text files. It's super simple, but it's very machine readable. And what I like to say is that GTFS has created a quiet revolution in public transport data analysis and urban analytics to some extent, because it is so simple. You have geospatial coordinates of your timetable, so to speak. It has become the de facto standard data for public transport use across industry. So all of the apps you can imagine you have on your phone and you're making trip planning on your phone, they're actually making queries on top of GTFS. And over 677 cities, this is actually outdated, it should be many more now, cities in the world share their public transport data openly using the GTFS standard. I've heard the UK and Europe in general are not such a big fans of GTFS, but I know there are many brave colleagues and computer scientists who are coming up with very simple tools to use to convert the local standards into GTFS. Why I think GTFS creates this quiet revolution is the fact that GTFS, once it becomes a common standard used across the globe, it creates a common place for sharing and learning from each other. So whatever software or computer package you develop in Washington, DC to analyze your GTFS data can be used for planners in Tokyo. Or if you develop a new R or Python package in Indonesia, we can use it in Brazil. So it creates a common ground for learning and sharing, which is, I think, a fantastic thing. And it's really making things changing much, much faster when it comes to urban analytics and transportation planning because of GTFS. And because of GTFS, I use a lot of GTFS data to engage with two broad topics in research. One of them is access to opportunities, and the other one is estimating environmental emissions. And I'll talk a bit about both of them, but I'll mostly focus on the access to opportunities part, but I'll talk a bit about the emissions side as well. First, however, what is accessibility? I guess all of you are already familiar with the concept. Accessibility is a very common topic that has been addressed in spatial regional science and urban planning and GIS science for decades now. But I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, and I'll give a very simple explanation to what I mean by accessibility. So here's a person in a city. It could be any city in the world, right? And in the city, you usually have hundreds and thousands of opportunities and several possibilities of activities you could engage in. Restaurants, employment opportunities, healthcare facilities, and so on and so on. Here we are just looking at restaurants for the sake of simplicity. The thing is, that person cannot reach all of those restaurants in a single day, right? There's only some time you can allocate to engaging in activities. So let's say in the 30 minutes, this person can only get anywhere inside this area highlighted in yellow, which means that her accessibility will reflect how easy it is for her to reach activities. And it will ultimately determine which of those activities are accessible to her and which of those activities she's excluded from, so to speak. Now, there are very different ways in which you can try to improve accessibility and expand people's access to opportunities. And the thing is, there's different strategies, they do have different environmental costs. One of them is just expanding the accessible area. So you can improve the network connectivity of your transportation system, or you can increase the frequency of your subway line or your bus system, or ultimately increase the speed, reduce congestion. Now, there are much more intelligent alternatives when you think about increasing proximity. So increasing proximity can be done, for example, by increasing population density near the CBD or where there are clusters of activities, increasing the density of activities themselves, or just improving land use mix with some housing and land use regulations. And obviously, these alternatives are much cheaper and much greener, so they will have much more serious implications for promoting more just, inclusive, and sustainable cities. But in the end, we have been studying and we have been developing GIS methods to measure accessibility and transportation networks for like over quite a number of decades now. But why does accessibility matter in the first place? So from a social justice point of view, and here I bring my hat of moral philosophy and social justice theory, there are many different reasons why you would argue that accessibility is quite important for promoting just and sustainable cities. And what I'm talking about now are not just arguments that I came up with. These are arguments that have been spread and consolidated over the literature on transportation justice and equity for the past 10, 15 years. So one of the reasons is that from a sufficientarian point of view, having access to opportunities is essential for individuals to be able to satisfy their basic needs. If you're able to access a store to buy food for you, or to go to a healthcare center and get some medical treatment, for example, or just getting a job to provide income for your family. From an egalitarian point of view, all societies or modern societies are fundamentally concerned about inequality of opportunities. A just society is a society where everyone has the same fair access to opportunities. And thinking about accessibility, help us think about this explicitly, help us think about more explicitly about the spatial dimension, about what inequality of opportunities means. From a human development perspective and a capabilities perspective, being able to access activities provides people the freedom to choose which activities they value and they want to engage in. And it will give them the freedom to participate in those activities and develop other human capabilities, take music lessons, or going to the university, or taking going to school, and so on and so forth. And finally, from an environmental perspective, where you live, well, depending on where you live, you might have fundamentally different levels of access to opportunities and transportation modes. So your level of accessibility ultimately will have a tremendous impact about the travel choices you are able or not able to make in terms of making more or less sustainable mobility choices and affecting cities' sustainable mobility patterns. I get a bit annoyed every time people say I'm a transportation person. Oh, Rafa, you're a transportation person, but I like to see myself an accessibility or justice, social justice person, because accessibility is not just about transportation. It is a very powerful concept that helps us articulate a human-centered approach to urban and spatial planning. Because it's not about the transport modes that you use or the transportation network that you use. It is about this holistic understanding about where people live. What are the land use patterns around their neighborhoods and their city? What are the transportation choices, the public services available, and the geography of opportunities? It's all of those things combined at the same time. It's not just transportation. It's not just about land use. It's not just about people's characteristics and personal capabilities. It's the whole package. You cannot think about accessibility just looking at one of these aspects. It's all things combined. And I'm quite happy to see how far the field of GIS science, spatial data science, urban analytics, we can choose the name we use. I'm very satisfied to see how far we have come with measuring accessibility over the past few years. I say this because just 66 years ago, when I finished my PhD in 2018, doing accessibility modeling and transportation network analysis was doable, much more doable than 10, 15 years ago. But it was quite of a hassle to calculate travel time matrices and do accessibility analysis for large urban areas. I would take literally the whole week computing like large travel time matrices for the city of Rio with multiple travel times using OpenTrip Planner on a really large computer with 1 terabyte of RAM at the university. It was a full week. Nowadays, we can do this in your personal laptop in 30 minutes, 20 minutes, depending on the city. It's just like this. So one thing that has made measuring accessibility much easier today is that we have over a dozen tools of open source tools. I'm not talking about commercial tools. Open source tools to calculate, to do routing analysis, to do accessibility and network models. Here are just a few tools for multimodal routing, which allows you to calculate accessibility or do routing analysis combining transportation modes like walking and buses, or buses and trains and subways and trams and so on and so forth. Not to mention all of the other tools that are not focused on multimodal, but they are allowed to do for cycling or for walking or for cars and so on. Literally 6 years ago, this slide would have been much, much different. And we thank a lot of computer scientists and the wide GIS community who's been pursuing and doing lots of work on this front. But it's not just about the software, it's also about the data. Because to calculate accessibility, we need a few different types of data sets, but nowadays we have a plethora of sources of open data sets which are available globally. So for example, we have gridded population estimates at very high spatial resolution for different resolution levels for the entire globe. You can choose. It's kind of you just choose from the menu which one you want, which one is more robust for the application you're using, but it's there. It's for free, and you can download it on your R package or just clicking on the website. OpenStreetMaps. It has been a tremendous effort by the community worldwide, and it has been very beautiful to see how OpenStreetMap is expanding globally, and it's covering a lot of places. And the coverage in general is not so good for addresses and for buildings, but for road networks, it's quite astounding, the quality of OpenStreetMap for most places, including in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, for example. In topography, there are also several sorts of digital elevation models available out there. NASA in particular has this 30-meter shuttle radar topography mission, which releases lots of data openly. So you can get one of those software, those routing tools, any of these data sets, and you can calculate accessibility for walking and cycling and by car for pretty much, not all, but pretty much anywhere in the world in your personal laptop in 10 minutes. And the thing is, this is becoming so powerful that now we are seeing an increasing number of large-scale national projects that are developing accessibility estimates for different countries. So the United States with David Levinson, when he created the Accessibility Observatory a few years ago. Finland with Henrique and colleagues have been doing this for quite a while now. Dutch in the Netherlands, well, several other countries, but I wanted to highlight the Netherlands because the people who are doing it are in the government. So most of these are academic activities, right? Including the one from the UK that Rafael and colleagues here at Glasgow are doing. Most of them are academic initiatives which are remarkable and they should be praised. But I like to emphasize the fact that in the Netherlands, it's a governmental institution which is developing accessibility estimates. In Europe with OECD and the European Commission, they are also developing accessibility estimates. We are doing this in Brazil as well. And I wanted to highlight especially Canada because the institution in Canada, which is doing this, is the official statistics office of Canada. So they're not just publishing accessibility estimates. These are official accessibility statistics published by the government, used by local governments with a mandate to improve transportation access and access to health and access to education and access to all sorts of activities. And the nice thing is that Canada is actually using R5R, which is one of the packages we developed, so I'm quite happy with that as well. And in Brazil, we do have our own project as well. So I'll talk about the project just a bit. So once I finished my PhD in the UK, I went back to Brazil, and in my PhD, I did a lot of work on one city, Rio. But working for a federal government in a large country like Brazil, I cannot just pick and choose one city. So I needed to do a more comprehensive work, and we came up with the Access to Opportunities project. And this is a collaboration with colleagues from the Brazilian federal government, civil society, but we have plenty of collaborators in academia across the globe as well. So the Access to Opportunities project has three main aims. One of them is deriving annual estimates of access to employment, healthcare, education, and social welfare services by various transport modes at a very fine spatial resolution for Brazil's largest urban areas. Mostly everything that we do, we use open data or we make our data open using open source code in R and Python, mostly R. And we do also some interactive visualizations, and I want to mention that it's not just about the papers and the publications, which are quite nice, and I really love them, to be honest, but it's also about creating public goods. It's about getting the message across and making the data set, all the results available so all the researchers can use. And ultimately, because all the data that we are producing, we are not able ourselves to analyze the entirety of all the possibilities we could have. So it's important for us to make this data available so local governments and students and researchers in Brazil and across the globe can use this data to inform transportation planning, or planning and evaluation and policy evaluation more broadly. So right now we started this project in 2018-19. So we estimated accessibility estimates for 2017, 18, and 19. Obviously, we had some problem in between called COVID. So we stopped the project in terms of data collection. We just focused on publications and tools. And we're now resuming the project in the next, this year and the next year. So we calculate access by walking, cycling, public transport, and by private cars for all of the 20 largest cities in Brazil. For some cities, we have GTFS data, the public transport data that I mentioned before. But for a few of them, we still don't. So for those cities, we only calculate access by walking, cycling, and by car. The nice news that I want to share is that we will be expanding the project to cover the 187 largest metropolitan areas of the country, which will cover approximately 640 municipalities and 50% of the population of Brazil. Brazil is a 200 million population country, so this is a quite large effort. But as I said, because of the public data sets that we have and the software that has been developed over the past few years, this is super doable. So what we do is basically we combine all of those data sets that I mentioned from bottom to top: satellite imagery data, household census, administrative records that we have to geolocate the location of businesses, schools, healthcare facilities, and so on and so forth, collaborative mapping with OSM and GTFS. So we're literally combining household surveys with satellite imagery data, with administrative records, all of this packaged in open source software, and we're ultimately getting into those accessibility estimates. It's funny that I've been talking for quite a while now, and I haven't mentioned any accessibility estimates. So this is the city of São Paulo. When I talk about accessibility, this is a very clear example of what I'm talking about. This map shows the proportion of jobs in the city of São Paulo that you could reach just using public transport in up to 60 minutes. One of the most simple and traditional accessibility metrics, this is called the cumulative opportunity metric. The nice thing is that you show this to a mayor or a politician, whatever, or any practitioner on the field, they will immediately relate to what you're showing them. If I use the gravity-based accessibility metric or more floating-based catchment area analysis, this would be a little bit more tricky. But with this one, you can get the message across like this. So you can see that even if you're not familiar with São Paulo, you can already identify where are the large capacity transportation corridors, the subways, the BRTs, and even there on the extreme east side of the city, there is a bright spot in the middle of a dark area. So there's kind of a desert of opportunity. This is the east side of São Paulo, which is very famous for being economically deprived, but that's the subway station. So regardless if you live far from the city center, if you can quickly connect to that subway station will unlock a number of opportunities in a very short amount of travel time for you. So it's not just about where you live. It's not just about the transportation network. It's about the combination of all those things at the same time. Another very simple type of accessibility metric is this map on the right-hand side, where we're showing the travel time to get to the closest hospital, a high-capacity hospital or a high-complexity hospital in São Paulo as well. So if you live in one of those yellow areas, you would spend less than 5 minutes. In green areas, something between 10 and 20. And in dark blue, these are what we call the deserts of opportunities. These are places from where you would need more than 30 minutes by public transport to reach a hospital. Now, imagine we have these maps with not only these two indicators, but also other indicators for jobs of low, medium, and high education, healthcare facilities of low, medium, and high complexity, healthcare facility, education of primary, well, 3 levels of education. I won't remember all the categories now. For men, women, different ages, different income levels, different races, for all of these 20 cities, and now we're expanding for all of those metropolitan regions that I mentioned. Can you do one paper with this? You could do several papers with this. You could evaluate several transportation policies. If we are making these estimates every single year, you can follow and measure the impact of new transportation infrastructure investments, or new schools, or new healthcare facilities investments, and so on and so forth. This is not something that one single person or one single team can do. And that's why we're making all of these things, all of these outputs publicly available, so it creates a public good. So there are several outputs from this. Obviously, we have a few papers. Very early in COVID-19, we were able, in the beginning of the pandemic, we used the data that we had already collected, and we used a little bit of a more sophisticated accessibility metric to calculate income and racial inequalities in access to healthcare services, but not only looking at whether you can quickly get to the healthcare service, because you might live 5 minutes away from the hospital. If that's the only hospital there is in the region where you live, everyone will go to the same hospital. So you will be waiting in a queue to get your appointment. So we use this relatively new indicator called the balanced floating catchment area, where we can account not only for the physical proximity and accessibility, but also for capacity constraints in providing the service. And the result was sad, but not of a big surprise, in the sense that low-income neighborhoods and mostly Black minorities, they are systematically deprived of access to healthcare service in general and during COVID in particular. We also teamed up with some colleagues. This was a very nice paper we did. We gathered various colleagues doing accessibility analysis with roughly similar methods across the globe, and we published, which is, I think, perhaps one of the largest global benchmarks of employment accessibility across 117 cities in 16 countries for different transportation modes. And the US is great for cars, but terrible for public transport, but that's not of a big surprise. China performs really well. Brazil is not that great, but that's not a big surprise either. And we also developed new methods and tools and open source methods. So these are just a few of the R packages and Python packages we have developed. I will not talk about all of them, but I just wanted to mention 3 of them. The first one is R5R, which is the rapid realistic routing with R5 and R. So one of those multimodal routing engines that I mentioned before is called R5, which is developed by a tremendous team at Conveil in Washington, D.C. in the US. So they are the ones who were initially the core developers of OpenTripPlanner, but they moved away from OpenTripPlanner. OpenTripPlanner is still being developed, but they moved away from OTP to develop a new generation multimodal routing engine, which is called R5, which is incredibly fast. The thing is, R5 is written in Java, and not many people in spatial data science, we don't speak Java that much, but we do a lot of R and Python. So we developed the R package to run R5R, and we teamed up with Henrique, colleagues from Finland and Canada, to develop the Python version R5Pi. So whatever your religion is, if you pray for the R gods or the Python gods, you can choose the ones you like. And with R5 or R5Pi, you can do fast routing on multimodal transportation networks. and you very easily and quickly calculate travel times, distances, trip planning, isochrones, accessibility. But the nice thing is that it has several more advanced features that allow you for account for level of traffic stress that cyclists might be willing to tolerate, terrain elevation. You can calculate monetary costs and do various aggregations of departure times over different time windows to overcome the modifiable temporal unit problem. So we are all familiar with the modifiable areal unit problem. There is the temporal cousin, the temporal unit, modified temporal unit problem. We can talk about that later. So you can do, very quickly with 2 calls of R code, you can calculate travel time matrices, do some trip planning where you give not only the fastest route, but also different route alternatives and suboptimal trips as well. And R5 and R5R, and consequently R5Pi, they are blazing fast. You don't need to take my word for this. So Chris Higgins and colleagues from Toronto University published a paper where they did a very quick benchmark comparing ArcGIS, OpenTripPlanner with R and Python, R5R and EMI, to calculate travel time matrices and accessibility for several different sizes. Yeah. So here's the summary. If you're doing relatively small travel time matrices, let's say a 100 by origins by 100 destinations, R5 is 200 times faster than ArcGIS. 100 times and 300 times are faster than OTP and EMI. But if you're working with very large travel time matrices, let's say 100,000 origins and 100,000 destinations, R5 was the only tool that managed to complete the task. And even with just 10,000 by 10,000, a task that would take you about 50 minutes or 1 hour in ArcGIS, you can do this in your laptop in R in 8 minutes. So it's not bad. I mean, I wish I had this during my PhD because it would save me a lot of time running data. The other package that I want to mention is called accessibility. It's also an R package, which basically, once you calculate the travel time matrices and you have the spatial distribution of population and land use, how you combine the travel time matrix with the population and land use data to calculate accessibility. This has to be combined, and there are different indicators. So accessibility provides very fast and convenient functions to calculate a number of accessibility indicators. And the package is being updated every now and then. So if you have published a new accessibility index and you want to include it in the paper, just send us a shout on GitHub. We're happy to implement the code, and it's there. We also make available variables decay functions. The user can use any customized decay function as well. And more recently, we included some very convenient metrics to calculate inequality measures of accessibility and poverty. So when you're thinking about inequality of access to opportunities, how can we measure this? If we're thinking about people who are in transportation poverty, how can we measure this? Obviously, these are not simply statistical measures. There are moral, philosophical, political discussions about how you define a accessibility poverty threshold. But that's not the topic of the conference today. We can talk about this later. And finally, the AOP data package. Remember the Access to Opportunities project? We were developing all of these dozens and dozens of data sets. So you can download them directly from the website, but if you're an R user, you can just use the AOP data package. And with this package, you can download the spatial distribution of population by population count, sex, age, income, and race, spatial distribution of jobs, healthcare facilities, and so on, and several accessibility estimates for different modes, different times of the day, and so on and so forth, during peak time and off peak. So here's how it looks like. With one simple call of R, just say AOP data ... read access. So here we are reading the accessibility data of the city of Curitiba or the public transport mode in the year 2019 during the off-peak time, and we want the geometry, so we have a simple feature spatial data. That's it. I don't need to repeat. It's just one single line of code. And with another line of code in ggplot, you create a map like this. Is this the most beautiful map you have ever seen? Definitely not. But it is incredibly powerful that you give this to a policymaker or a practitioner who knows very little of R. And with this, they can plug and get all the data like this. So one thing that I like to emphasize, especially for masters and PhD and students and postdocs, is that getting papers out there is fine. Actually, it's kind of ideal. You should publish, but that's not enough. Oftentimes, if you're developing a new method or if you're developing a new tool, you have to package it, make it available to others, make it usable to other people, get the message across. And creating these data packages or function packages, method packages, either in R or Python, wherever your religion is, it is fundamental to get the word across. Two other outputs we have from the Access to Opportunities project. We recently published an online book, which was written entirely in R using Quarto, called Introduction to Urban Accessibility, a practical guide with R. So if you want to get familiar with the concept of accessibility, the indicators of accessibility, and get your hands-on, because this is a hands-on book on how you get to write R code to run accessibility analysis and evaluate the accessibility impacts of transportation projects, you can start here. And also, it has a nice chapter on GTFS data as well. And we are now currently working on another book on advanced topics and accessibility. The book is in contract with Routledge, and it's being written in collaboration with Chris Higgins and Antonio Pais from Canada, Toronto University and McMaster University. And we hope to get the book published in 2025. But this will also be an online free book. So we hope the book will be online soon in the next month or so, at least the first few chapters that we have ready. That's all about accessibility for now. I want to talk very quickly about emissions. Otherwise, I would not be talking so much about sustainability, and I think that's kind of part of the conference. So, as I said, GTFS is quite a fantastic data source, but we wanted to explore it further, not only for accessibility purposes. We wanted to use it to develop a scalable model of public transport emissions. So the idea here is trying to come up with a method that allows us, with minimum data requirements and reproducible data pipelines and code, to estimate the environmental benefits and justice implications of electrification and fleet renovation renewal policies. So recently we published this paper where we are introducing the GTFS to emissions, or GTFS to emiss package. So it's basically a simple package that it provides a generalizable method to estimate the emissions of every single vehicle in your public transport system, vehicle by vehicle, at very fine spatial and temporal resolution with very simple input. You only need two inputs. You need the GTFS feed of your city and a table with the fleet, some characteristics of your fleet. Like what is the make of the buses, what is the age of the buses, what is kind of the fuel technology they're running on, and so on. This could be a detailed table for every single vehicle, how they look like. Or if you don't have that, you can be just a composition, a table with the composition, like 20% of my fleet was made in 2018, 30% is Euro 4, or in something like this. That's it. That's all you need. After that, you should select what pollutants you're interested in and indicate what emission factor models we are using. We currently have emission models from Brazil, Europe, and 2 models from the United States, but we're hoping to expand it to other regions of the world as well. So this is how the model works in a very general terms. The first step is you run the transport model function, which will get the GTFS data, and it will convert into a data, a trajectory data that looks like a table with movement data and trajectory of every single vehicle in very fine spatial and temporal resolution. It's like a GPS-like kind of data table. And then the second function, you just run the emission model function, passing what the emission factor you want, and the table with the fleet characteristics. And for every vehicle running at a certain speed with certain characteristics, you expect that vehicle will be emitting this amount of CO2 or particulate matter 0.10 and so on and so forth. So it's a very simple tool. You can very quickly run it for various cities in the world because of GTFS. and it will give you a very fine estimates in time and space. And because GTFS is promoting that quiet revolution, we can very quickly estimate environmental emissions for Houston, Sydney, Curitiba, Rome, whatever city has GTFS. So moving forward with this specific project, we are currently working on a paper trying to develop an environmental benchmark of transportation systems across several cities in the globe. We are looking for partners because we need not only the GTFS of many cities, but also the number of passengers that are being transported in each public transport system. And we think this tool could have an immense potential for analyzing the potential environmental benefits if you're renewing your fleet or electrifying your fleet, how much CO2 you are saving by doing this kind of policies, and which transit routes in your city should you first prioritize if you're electrifying your fleet or renewing the fleet. And there could be some potential research on, once you estimate the emissions that are coming out of the buses, what socioeconomic groups and neighborhoods are more or less exposed from that pollution once you integrate with pollution dispersion models as well. And here I want to close my presentation with just a very quick few topics for a research agenda. Mostly on the accessibility part, but there is a bit on the emissions as well. So the first one is about monetary costs. If you look at the accessibility literature for the past 20, 30 years, 9 out of 10 people are talking about travel time. The travel time that takes you to go from A to B. How many opportunities you access in 20 minutes. Or you calculate your decay function based on the travel time. More recently, we are seeing a few people looking beyond travel time. And when they do this, they think about the monetary costs. But usually they convert the monetary costs and the travel times into a single generalized travel cost function. So let's say you earn an income of this amount per month. So your hour costs this amount. You convert everything to money, and that's it. Or you convert everything to time, and that's it. But there are several evidences in the literature that shows that if you're using this generalized travel cost analysis, you're running into trouble because you're bringing into so much socioeconomically inequalities and biases into your analysis that your analysis will ultimately reinforce social inequities in cities. The second problem is you're not really looking at trade-offs, because for every origin destination pair, you can, let's say, walk from here to the city center, and it will take you 50 minutes. It will cost you barely nothing. Or you could take the bus and the subway, and it will cost you a little bit more, and it will be much faster. And between those two options, there are several other alternatives, which combined will give you a Pareto frontier of what are the most optimal combinations of travel time and monetary cost. And nowadays, we are only looking at travel times. And the people who are looking at travel costs are just looking at the travel cost of the fastest trip, and not the travel cost of some trips which might not be super fast, but they are cheaper. The problem is different people have different constraints. Rich people, they're usually more poor in time than they're poor of money, while poor people are more poor of money than usually they're poor of time. So these trade-offs mean that different people with different constraints will have different behaviors, and they will make different choices. So when we do this accessibility calculations and we're assuming that everyone will behave the same, this is kind of a very gross simplification of reality. Once we start thinking about this trade-offs between travel times and monetary costs, this allows us to think about more heterogeneous agents and incorporate heterogeneity in human behavior into our agent-based models, accessibility estimates, travel behavior prediction models, and so on and so forth. The question is how we do this. I'm not entirely sure how we do this. Anson Stewart and Matthew Conway they were one of the first who published a paper looking into this trade-offs. We recently published a paper on Nature looking at the trade-offs of travel time and cost, looking at ride-hailing accessibility by ride-hailing, accessibility by public transport, and accessibility combining both. But we still don't really know how much that how that can be incorporated into other sorts of models. I think there is kind of a big research avenue that is open here. And I would be very excited to see other researchers looking into this as well. We are currently actually submitting a paper in the next few weeks where we demonstrate what happens when you don't look at travel time trade-offs. If you completely overlook monetary costs, you're basically exaggerating accessibility for everyone, and you're underestimating inequalities of accessibility. Because the poor people would have been left outside of the system if you considered monetary costs. But if you're only looking at travel time, which 90% of the researchers do, 90% of us do, that would be a problem. If you're only looking at the travel cost of the fastest trip with the simple approach, you would also be creating all sorts of biases into your accessibility estimates and your estimates of inequalities of access to opportunities. So when you do the trade-off, you have a much more nuanced understanding, and that's what we'll be demonstrating in this paper, trying to convince people that they should look at these trade-offs. The nice thing is that you can actually calculate monetary costs and the Pareto frontier with R5R, thanks to the guys at Conveo and the team who's developing R5R as well. There is, I think, also a tremendous research agenda about access-oriented network design. We hear a lot about transit-oriented development. We are gradually hearing more about accessibility-oriented development. And I think there is also a lot of work that could be done about access-oriented network design. So how should you design or redesign your transportation network, trying to maximize accessibility, but also maximize accessibility for those who need the most? There are several challenges there. I won't go so much into detail, but it literally tells about how to redesign the transit networks and land use as well. Because again, it's not just about the transportation network, but where should you build a housing complex, or where you should make more flexible land use regulations to increase population density in a way that would increase accessibility and make a more optimal use of your transportation network. And ultimately, how a lot of these interventions will affect your public transport ridership. Think that public transport ridership is the utility that people derive from the public transport system. People don't use the public transport system because it's fun. People use it because it helps them get to where they need to go. So people drink a lot of beer because they take some utility out of this. The more you like beer, the more you drink it. The more the public transport system is useful for you, the more you will use it, at least in theory. So the more accessibility a transportation network is providing, the more people will ride it. And we are trying to make this causal connections between the accessibility that is promoted by a transportation network and by each transit line and the transit ridership that transit line gets. I think this is perhaps the most important one. If I had to recommend one single topic, it would be this one. But that's, very personal preference. It's the impact of access on outcomes. So we do a lot of descriptive research measuring how our societies are unequal, how some neighborhoods have better access to opportunities than others. But so what? Ultimately, we want to understand to what extent those inequalities in access to opportunities will hinder socioeconomic, health, and employment outcomes. If you have better access to school, will you be performing better academically, or you will have lower dropout rates for children? If you live closer to healthcare facilities, will you maybe improve vaccination rates of your population? And if there is an economic crisis and you get unemployed, and maybe perhaps you live in a city center very, very close to several opportunities, perhaps will you bounce back to the labor market more quickly? So all of these different sorts of questions are ultimately trying to take us to what extent the spatial access opportunities can help us think about social mobility and making people from lower income classes improve their lives and overcome inequalities of opportunities in cities. So there are several different challenges here. I'll leave this for you guys to read later. But the most important thing is there is a lot of endogeneity. Do people who are poor, do they have low accessibility because they are poor? Or they are poor because they have low accessibility? So that's what economists, I'm not an economist, but I work with a lot of them. So I learned some of the jargon. So a lot of economists say this is endogenous. You cannot say who is the chicken, what comes first, the chicken or the egg. And to overcome this kind of problems, there are all sorts of different research methods and causal inference methods that are trying to untangle what is cause and effect with quasi-experimental models and all sorts of different strategies with external shocks and so on. And I think we should do much better in learning these methods and just moving out of our comfort zone and doing spatial analysis that give us very nice descriptive maps, but bring us more informative data and actionable data to evaluate policy decisions and the impact these policies have on people's lives. One of them, I really like this one. I'm not so much into data gardeners and data pollinators, but if you're looking into participatory planning and community engagement, there is a fantastic opportunity to use accessibility modeling tools with communities. This is built on the work of Anson Stewart and Chris Sigris at MIT. This was part of Anson's PhD thesis. And because R5 is incredibly fast, they developed this really large dashboard where you get people around it. And on the fly, people are just clicking on the dashboard. And the accessibility analysis is being updated on the fly. So if you gather your community and different people around this big tablets, you're helping them realize different interventions to the transport system and where you build housing and how all of these different interventions would have implications for their accessibility and the accessibility of their neighbors and so on and so forth. So this is not so much of an academic research, but the possibility of bringing academic research into policy making and engaging with communities, which I think we dearly need. And finally, because I need to talk about sustainability, I wanted to mention that there are environmental costs of access. And in a recent paper published by Elias Wilberg and colleagues from in collaboration with colleagues from Finland, this was part of Elias' PhD. We discussed about this environmental tensions between access and the environmental footprint that we leave in the planet. The thing is, there are also tensions like you want to promote accessibility, you want people to have better access to activities, but depending on how you promote their accessibility, this could come at environmental costs as well. Like if you want to give, I've seen quite a few colleagues in the United States, and a few of them say that there is a very big problem of accessibility poverty in the rural US. The solution to them, give them cars. Great, right? Very American, quite of the American dream. It would be a tremendous solution for their accessibility problem, wouldn't it? But I guess it would come at severe environmental costs. So a lot of us should think more carefully about this tension between the two and just not think immediately that, yeah, more accessibility, the better. How you are improving people's access. And I think it circles back to one of the first slides that I had about if you're expanding people's reachable area or if you're just increasing density and land use mix in short distances as well. And what I like about this topic for a future research agenda is that we do have lots of multimodal routing engines that give us travel times and monetary costs, and you calculate accessibility on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have lots of tools which are estimating the transport emissions of transport systems or buses or trips. But we don't really have a single tool that makes this integrated analysis. And I think that's a really big spot for that. When I created the GTFS to emissions package, that was my future vision. But nowadays, I don't see how I could do it with the two with R5R and GTFS treatments. They are not really, as much as I wanted, they don't really talk to one another. So that's a problem that I haven't solved that I would be very glad to hear if someone has solved already. I know Henrique and colleagues are doing tremendous work looking at this, and they were talking about this today, I think in the afternoon. So go to Henrique's session. You can pay me later. Anyway, and finally, as I said, expanding people's access will have different environmental implications depending on the transport mode alternatives and land use intervention scenarios that you have in mind. So this is all that I had to speak today. I wanted to thank my team, and there is a very large number of collaborators, which is an expanding number of people. So I'm happy to connect, and that's all I had for today. I'm very happy to take any questions and engage in discussions with you guys.